Hi, my name is Pooja Nair, and thank you for joining us today on this webinar. I'm a litigation partner at Ervin Cohen Jessup, and I'm the head of the firm's food, beverage, and hospitality practice group. ECJ is a full-service law firm. We do litigation, corporate law, real estate, tax, and wills and trusts, and we're based in Beverly Hills, California. Our firm's been around for almost 70 years now. The food, beverage, and hospitality practice group started this past summer. We represent all types of food, beverage, and hospitality companies. And just to give you an example of some of the clients that we work with restaurant groups, food and beverage manufacturers, CPG companies, hotels, tech companies that are in the food and hospitality space, and all kinds of beverage companies as well. One of the reasons that we started this practice group this past summer was to provide guidance for our clients on the COVID-19 pandemic. And to support that goal, one of the things that we've been doing is providing regular, timely updates on the constant opening and reopening and rule changes in both Los Angeles County, Southern California, and California and the federal government generally. That includes restaurant reopenings, travel guidance, and restrictions. And those are available on our Legal Bites blog, which we also do as email updates. And we've also been focused on providing updates on federal relief for the food, beverage, and hospitality industry, which has been a moving target and something that we see in the news all the time. I'm joined today by my colleague, Yasmin Azodi, who is an attorney at ECJ's Business, Corporate, and Tax Department. And Yasmin has written our firm's client alerts on the stimulus bills and the PPP loans. So she's covered both rounds of those loans in terms of telling clients what's available and providing updates. So I'm speaking with Yasmin today to just go over what the second round of PPP loans and the most recent stimulus bill means for the food, beverage, and hospitality industry. Before we go into our questions with Yasmin, I want to talk a little bit about some of the recent statistics that most of our audience is familiar with. So according to the 2020 National Restaurant Association report, 110,000 restaurants closed in 2020, and there was a $240 billion decline in revenue in food and beverage sales. This past November 2020, the American Hotel and Lodging Association reported that 71% of hotels would not be able to survive another 6 months without further federal assistance. Now, given the huge number of jobs that the food, beverage, and hospitality industry creates, there was significant momentum in 2020 to have specific relief targeting the industry. And the most prominent of that was the Restaurants Act, which would have set aside $120 billion for independent restaurants. And that had broad bipartisan support and was included in the stimulus bill that the House passed towards the end of 2020, but ultimately was not included in the most recent stimulus bill. And so we're talking today with Yasmin about what the stimulus bill did include and what specifics the food, beverage, and hospitality industry really got in the stimulus bill. So Yasmin, thank you so much for joining today. Can we talk first about what the Paycheck Protection Loan Program is? What was the intended purpose the first time that PPP loans were issued, and has that changed now?
Yeah, first of all, I'm happy to be here. Second of all, the Paycheck Protection Program provides forgivable loans to small businesses to help them combat the adverse economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the loans are intended to help the businesses stay afloat and retain their employees. The purpose hasn't changed with this new stimulus bill. That's still the goal, but some flexibility has been added, for example, with respect to the covered period, the types of expenses that are forgivable, and allowing certain borrowers to take out a second draw loan.
And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics as we go on with this, but sticking to the more general theme, what agency in the federal government administers paycheck protection loans, and who's responsible for deciding if the loans are ultimately forgivable?
So the Small Business Administration provides really helpful guidelines about the loans and forms, but ultimately borrowers have to apply for the loan with their lender, and the lender will administer the funds. And it's a similar process for forgiveness. The SBA has put out the forms and the guidelines, but ultimately your forgiveness application goes to the lender. The lender makes a determination as to what portion of the loan will be forgiven and then passes that determination along to the Small Business Administration.
And several of our clients already received a first round of Paycheck Protection loans back when the program was introduced. If a company has received a first round PPP loan, what is the criteria for them to be eligible for a second PPP loan?
There's a few requirements that a borrower has to meet to get a second draw loan. The first is that the borrower and its affiliates don't have more than 300 employees. The second is that the borrower has to show at least a 25% reduction in its gross receipts in any 2020 calendar quarter as compared to that same quarter in 2019. And finally, the borrower has to have already used or will use the full amount of its initial disbursement by the date the second draw loan is dispersed. And on that note, borrowers who receive their initial loan within 90 days of their application for a second loan are capped at a $10 million aggregate for the two loans combined.
And how is the maximum loan amount generally calculated?
So for most borrowers, it's going to be the lower of $2 million and 2.5 times their average monthly payroll costs for the 1 year period before the loan or for calendar year 2019.
Can you remind us what expenses were initially considered forgivable under the first, when the loans were first issued?
Yeah, so originally the forgivable expenses were pretty narrow. It only covered things like payroll costs, rent, and utilities.
And has that changed now with the next round of PPP loans?
Yes, so the new stimulus bill expands the types of expenses that are forgivable. It goes way past the first set. So it's things such as supplier costs, facility modifications to comply with guidelines, PPE required to operate safely, business software and cloud computing services to help facilitate your business operations, and also property damage due to vandalism or looting from 2020 public disturbances that weren't covered by insurance.
And that would help a lot of clients that are based in kind of the Los Angeles area, or actually a lot of cities that were affected by looting or violence earlier in 2020.
Absolutely.
And you had mentioned earlier something about a covered period. Can we talk a little bit about what that means?
Right. So as a reminder, the covered period is the period during which the borrower has to spend their PPP funds on forgivable expenses in order for those expenses to qualify for forgiveness. And with this new stimulus bill, borrowers can now choose between a covered period of 8 weeks to 24 weeks, with the period beginning on the date of loan origination.
With the period beginning on the date of loan origination. And when is loan origination? Is that when the loan is actually dispersed?
I believe that's the case, yes.
Okay. And since we're talking about the food, beverage, and hospitality industry, could you tell us about any special provisions for that industry that is in this in the PPP loans for this stimulus bill?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a few special rules for businesses that fall within NAICS Code 72, which is accommodation and food services. These businesses include hotels, restaurants, caterers, and bars, for example. The biggest difference is that these borrowers are eligible for a higher maximum loan amount for the second draw. So these borrowers are able to take out 3.5 times their monthly payroll costs, or their average payroll costs, rather than 2.5 times. But note that they are still subject to the $2 million cap for the second draw. And another difference is that for purposes of eligibility for the second draw, these businesses can't have more than 300 employees per physical location rather than in the aggregate.
Now, one thing that's come up a lot in the news had been a controversy about larger chains, and that included large restaurants and large hotel chains being eligible for the loans. Was anything done in the stimulus bill or the second round of PPP to address that issue?
Yeah, so there are some stricter requirements for the second draw as compared to the first draw. So for example, the borrower has to show a reduction of at least 25% in its gross receipts, and the borrower has to have less than 300 employees per physical location rather than 500.
And I've heard a little bit about a simplified loan forgiveness process for smaller businesses that get smaller amounts of loans. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that works and who's eligible?
Right. So as far as eligibility goes, it's borrowers whose loan is $150,000 or less. They're subject to a simplified forgiveness process. So the SBA has already put out a form for this simplified forgiveness application. It's essentially a letter certifying as to certain things about the loan, including the total amount of the loan, the number of employees that the borrower was able to retain due to the covered portion of the loan, and the estimated amount of the covered portion of the loan that was used for payroll costs. So there's the simplified application process, and also these borrowers are subject to less stringent record retention requirements. So these smaller borrowers only have to retain employment records for 4 years and other records for 3 years, whereas other larger borrowers have to retain these records for 6 years.
And what is the deadline for businesses to apply for a second round PPP loan?
It's March 31st, 2021.
Do you have any suggestions for resources that could provide more information to businesses on how to apply for the PPP loans?
Yeah, the Small Business Administration has done a really good job of putting out guidelines that are more in layman's terms than the types of terms you see in the stimulus bill itself. And they go into a lot more detail about things that the stimulus bill kind of just touches on. So I suggest looking to their website for the guidelines and the forms. And also borrowers can reach out to the bank that they do business with to see if they have further information to provide as well.
And one thing that I remember happening with the first round was that the SBA issued additional guidance to kind of clarify the stimulus bill. Do you expect that that'll happen again? And can you talk a little bit about the type of guidance that we saw from the SBA after the first round of PPP loans last time?
Yeah, so the SBA actually has put out some additional guidance for these second draw loans already, which, like the first round, is really helpful in clarifying certain things that the bill glossed over or maybe just didn't go into too much detail about. For example, for purposes of the second draw loan and calculating gross receipts, the bill doesn't provide a definition of gross receipts, but the SBA guidelines do. So if there are any points that are confusing or weren't necessarily touched on in the bill, I highly suggest looking at the SBA guidelines.
And that makes sense because the bill is what, over 5,000 pages?
Yeah.
And so it's pretty difficult even as lawyers to kind of dig through.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so your client alert was really helpful, and that's available on ECJ's website. And if you want a copy, you can always email us if you have any trouble finding it on the website. So I think that covers all the questions I had about the PPP loans. Thank you, Yasmin, for answering them. The other issue that I've heard about that I want to go into is business meal deductions, and that's really a tax issue, but that was something that that's new under this the stimulus bill that I haven't seen a lot of coverage on. So could you talk a little bit about what the stimulus bill does with regard to business meal deductions?
So it provides a temporary business expense deduction of 100% of food and beverages provided by a restaurant versus previously you were able to deduct 50%.
And when does that go into effect?
It's for amounts paid or incurred after December 31st, 2020.
And how long is that supposed to be in effect?
It'll go through January 1st, 2023. So amounts paid or incurred before January 1st, 2023.
And do you have a sense of what the anticipated effect of that could be on restaurants?
Yeah, we're thinking it'll probably lead to increased spending at restaurants, given that you can deduct 100% of those costs. So specifically probably for takeout, given that a lot of restaurants may still be closed for indoor dining due to the COVID restrictions.
That makes sense. I mean, we'll see what effect that'll have. There's been a lot of skepticism as that being particularly helpful, but I think we have yet to see kind of what effect that could have, especially as restaurants start to reopen again. Yasmin, thank you so much for joining. That was really, really helpful and provided a lot of answers. And thank you for writing those client alerts.
Of course.
I wanted to give everyone kind of a preview. So we've got a lot of executive actions that have already taken place under the Biden administration that will affect food, beverage, and hospitality, and a lot of proposals that are under effect, including an increased stimulus and relief that may affect restaurants and provide additional relief for the food, beverage, and hospitality industry. There's also a lot of changes to Department of Labor policies, Federal Trade Commission policies, and potentially an increase in the overall minimum wage to $15. So that's all things that we are keeping an eye on, and we are regularly updating our Legal Bites blog. And as everyone from California knows, California has revoked its regional stay-at-home orders, and outdoor dining, and in some counties, 25% capacity indoor dining is starting to open up as of this past week. So we'll see what happens and we'll keep you updated. If you have any follow-up questions about anything that we discussed on the program and you want to reach out to us directly, please feel free to reach out to Yasmin or me. Connect with us on LinkedIn, and you'll see that information on our closing slide coming up now. Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks for watching at home, and we look forward to connecting with you.